We have to snap the conversation back to the president talking today about the caravan. We'll do that and talk about it on the other side.
They're throwing rocks viciously and violently. You saw that 3 days ago, really hurting the military. We're not going to put up with that. They want to throw rocks at our military fights back. We're going to consider it. I told them, consider it a rifle. When they throw rocks like they did at the Mexico military and police, I say, consider it a rifle.
Jill, I heard Paul Rieckhoff, the founder of IAVA, Iraq combat veteran, tonight on another network saying they got rocks thrown at them constantly in Iraq. They never emptied their clip at someone in return. You couldn't ask for more of a broad contrast between these two events today.
Absolutely. The contrast here could not be clearer. Look, the president is planning a trip to Georgia on this weekend. Mike Pence was there today campaigning, but the split screen image that everyone saw today was Oprah Winfrey up on stage there versus the president delivering this very hardline speech in the White House, in the Roosevelt Room, delivering his vision on immigration. The president, in the final days of this campaign, has really focused on a campaign of fear and zeroing in on illegal immigration. Today, he talked about a plan. He said that he plans to sign an executive order next week that will crack down on asylum seekers. He says his plan is to prevent any asylum seekers who try to enter the country illegally between ports of entry, claiming that those people will not be allowed into the country, period. And then saying that he plans to erect tent cities of thousands of tents along the border in the southwest, full of asylum seekers. These are people who are coming to the country. These are people who fear for their lives, who fear for their safety, who are trying to take refuge in the United States. And the president has clearly tried to seize on these people, trying to paint them as dangerous, trying to paint them as people who will bring crime and danger to the families of America, as he tries in the final days of this campaign to energize Republican voters and get them to come out using the same playbook that he did in 2016, a playbook that for him was successful.
AB, react for me, please, to what Steve Schmidt said on Twitter tonight, and I quote, "The deployment of active duty U.S. armed forces to the U.S.-Mexican border in an operation named Faithful Patriot with lethal force authorized is a scandal. This is a shameful misuse and abuse of the U.S. military in service of Trump's desperate political stunts."
Well, I think that many people in the military feel that way, but this is not an illegal deployment. It was used, the same type of operation was used smaller scale by Presidents Bush and Obama. The military says yes to their commander-in-chief, and no one is going to resign over this, as much as this is making people all the way up to Secretary Mattis uncomfortable. Beyond this is the layering over of the birthright citizenship executive order, and now this other fictional executive order about restricting the criteria for asylum. It's very surreal, even by the Trumpian threshold. He's gotten into this frantic, sort of manic thing where each day he has to add a new layer of action to the caravan fear campaign theme. By Tuesday morning, it could be 60,000 troops because he keeps elevating the number. But what I wonder in terms of its effect, Brian, is if you are a Trump voter and he's raised the stakes with all this fear, but now he's told you there's all these executive orders and they've sealed the border, are you actually motivated to vote on Tuesday? Or have you had your fears assuaged by all these promises, all these quote unquote solutions that promise that there are people with rifles, no one's coming in, birthright citizenship is about to be ended? And asylum is going to be extremely narrowed down. I just don't know what these people believe.
And Jill, indeed, today, under the cloak of new policy, which didn't materialize, the president used, as you know, the backdrop of the stature of the Roosevelt Room in the West Wing across the hall from the Oval Office for today's announcement. There was a lot of talk about that. And to AB's point, how much more can he ratchet it up in these remaining rallies?
Well, exactly. I mean, the question is now it's almost every day the president has tried to unveil one of these new sort of shock and awe proposals, you know, from claiming yesterday that he was going to increase the number of troops along the border to up to 15,000 people, which is an extraordinary number, to his announcement about attempting to revoke the birthright citizenship right. I mean, every day we have had this buildup as the president attempts here to increase the stakes and also, as he's described it, really focus attention on the issue. We heard the president tonight at his rally talking about how he felt like momentum had been diverted by the incidents that we had last week, speaking about the person who sent the suspicious packages to those people, the president's critics, and then, of course, the synagogue shooting on Saturday, and the president talking about how he's interested in now reclaiming that momentum in the final days leading up into this race.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.